Today I apply the lighting fix to the new accurascale Deltic and make some fixes and upgrades to my Manor Class. Hi everyone, I'm Martin and welcome back to Donnington Castle Model Railway and to episode 2 of On Shed. Previously I have mentioned that these videos are going to be aimed at shining a spotlight more on the locos and rolling stock that I have for the layout. And they haven't been a priority up to this point because I've had so much work to do on the layout itself. But about a week ago from right now when I'm filming, I got an email from accurascale about an issue with their Deltic. And that was really the catalyst for me to spend a bit of time looking at a loco and also to take the opportunity to do some work on another accurascale loco that I've been putting off for a little bit as well. So today we're going to look at applying the lighting fix to an accurascale Deltic. And then we're also going to make a few improvements and a few fixes, both decoder-wise and physically to an accurascale Manor Class. So the first loco I'm going to look at today is this. It's the accurascale Deltic, and this is a Nimbus in BR Blue. And it might seem a bit odd to have a Deltic on a Western region layout. But when I was a kid back in the 80s, pretty much all of my books were published back in the 70s. And so when you turn to the pages on modern trains, it was always HST, the APTE, and of course Deltics, and traveling mainly on the West Coast main line back in those days. I never got to see one, so it became a little bit of an obsession. Every time I saw a 37, I used to ask my parents, "Is that a Deltic?" And the answer was always no. So when accurascale announced they were doing another run of the Deltics, and I'd seen how good the first run was, I mentioned it as a potential idea for a Christmas present, and I was really lucky to receive one. So that's why I've got one. At the moment, it's currently DC ready, so there's no chip in it. And to be honest, I hadn't really had a lot of time to even kind of look at it and run it. But when the email from accurascale came in last week, and I'll just pop a copy of that up onto screen if you've not seen it, I thought it might be a good chance to actually get it out of the box, get a chip in it, and see if I can do any work detailing it and things like that. Whilst also applying the fix that accurascale had mentioned. So let's get stuck into that as our first job. This is my on-loan Deltic Ballymoss, and you can see here the issue with those white marker lights showing. I'm going to apply the upgrades to this Deltic another day. So today we're going to focus on Nimbus. The first step in this process is to remove the body shell. Now that is held on with 4 clips. Those come off really easily. Just get your fingers underneath the edge of the body sides and that lifts off nice and cleanly. And next job for me was to remove the blanking plate and put a 21-pin decoder in there. Eventually I'll probably get this sound fitted. So for now I'm just using an old Hatton's 21-pin decoder. All of the functions on the Deltic won't be available with this. But the lighting and running the Deltic are all going to be fine with that. So as a temporary measure, I'm more than happy with that. So this is now down on the track, and you can see that PCB with the black fascia front of it. And it's those 2 bottom marker lights that are the issue. I believe that accurascale have a single fascia piece. And what happens is when there is a later variant, the bottom corners get snipped out. And for the earlier variants, the piece is used as is. What appears to have happened is that the fascias with the pieces snipped out have been put into these earlier locos by mistake. Now, that's just my interpretation based on looking at this. So the next step is going to be to get this over onto the workbench and to get the new fascias from accurascale. To get the new pieces, the email said to drop an email to support@accurascale.com. They also do have an online chat, so I believe that either way you can get in contact and let them know that you need them. So in terms of timescales, accurascale were awesome with this. I dropped them an email, I think it was Thursday night. They acknowledged that email early Friday, and then when I got home from work on the Monday, the pieces had arrived. As you can see, I'm following along from the email that was sent. This copy of the email is also on the accurascale support website titled Deltic Light Fix. So if you do need to see the information, then go on there. And this is where things started to get a little bit challenging. Now, as you can see in the instructions, it says just to remove the fascia. And I believe that on some of the Deltics that are out there, this is the case. However, here be dragons, because some of the Deltics, and that is both Nimbus and Ballymoss that I have this fascia glued onto the PCB. So it's at this point that I got in contact with accurascale support and just started to communicate with them about the best way forward. And what I decided I was going to do was to try and remove that black fascia, but make sure that I didn't damage the PCB behind it. At this point, I think it's really important to mention that if your Deltic doesn't have the fascias glued in, then it is a relatively straightforward process. However, if they are glued in, this is going to get a little bit more complicated, and I would highly suggest that you stop, get in contact with accurascale and really think about whether you are confident of going through this process. Because as you'll see, there are a few challenges ahead. First one for me was gently pulling at the fascia. I managed to get it to come off, but as you can see on this end of the loco, one of the spigots came free, but the other one snapped off and is embedded in the PCB still. On the other end, both spigots snapped off, but the PCB remained undamaged. Now, accurascale support were really helpful and responsive. And after a couple of exchanges, a way forward for me in this case was found. And that was to use a drawing pin to put a small indentation in the very center of each of the remaining spigots. Then to use the smallest drill bit I could find to drill through that. And then to use a drill bit that was the same diameter as the spigot itself to then finish drilling that out. And that 3-step process enabled me to create a very clean hole through there. I used the drill bits by hand and went really slowly with this. Fortunately, I don't have any batteries from my digital calipers, so I can't tell you the diameters of the drill bits, but it should be fairly obvious. I did that on both ends, and that allowed me then to put the new pieces into place, just making sure I didn't trap any of the wires in doing so. And those new fascias fit in really nicely. Okay, so enough of fixing. Let's move on to a bit of detailing, because in the Deltic box comes a few little bags of interesting accessories to add. So we'll start by looking at buffer beam detailing. And this is where things start to get a little bit frustrating. So in the instructions that come with the Deltic, there is a QR code to scan, which will take you supposedly to the website that contains lots of information about how to fit the buffer beam details. There is a picture in the instructions, but what it doesn't do is distinguish between the different variants and which components need to be fitted. Now, the fact that that information is on their website is mentioned in the instructions. So if we go and have a look at the website, we can see that information. However, the thing that's slightly challenging right now is that the information is only for the first production run, and none of the second production models are in there. But if we make a few assumptions, we can see that all of the post-tops Deltics are labeled as variant 3. So I'm going to make the assumption that Nimbus needs variant 3. And there are diagrams of what the buffer beams need to look like at the end of that page. So unless anyone's going to tell me that I made a bad assumption, I think I'm hopefully on the right track here. And it'd be great if accurascale could add details of the second run on here to make that a bit clearer. Also on the accurascale website, is a more detailed guide on fitting those details, which contains information about what each of the parts is, labels them up, and enables us to go through a process of fitting them on piece by piece. I decided that I was going to do this on the front of my Deltic because some of these bits would foul the coupling at the back. So I did those, worked through gluing them on with super glue, and ended up with a finished buffer beam that looked really cool. The advantage to the accurascale buffer beam as well is you'll see that they are detachable, so you can take them off and work on this on the workbench without damaging the rest of the loco. So I really do like that particular feature. Just held on with 2 screws, and again, that's all in the instructions. Another minor niggle I have is that there's nothing I can see in the instructions about fitting a whole host of other bits that are in the accessory bags. So there were some blue panels, there are some clear rectangles, the infamous bogey chains. All of those are in the accessories bags. So there's nothing in the instructions I can see, and there's nothing on the accurascale website about them. I have pinged support about that, and I hope they're working to get that information up there as soon as possible. What that does mean, however, though, is I'm not going to be able to fit some of these pieces because I'm not too sure what to do with them. As I'm going to have to do that later date, I'll come back and I'll do the nameplates another day, which is a pity. But one thing I can do while the body is off is fit some crew. In this case, I have some slightly underscale plastic figures that I bought job lot on eBay a while ago. You can't. It's not like a steam loco where the cab's really open, and so I'm going to use a couple of these figures in here. So they don't look too bad in there. I think they're passable, but I'm just going to fix them in with a blob of black tack, and that means I can come back and I can swap them out at a later date if I really want to. And there we have our fixed Deltic with some crew added and some buffer beam details on as well. So all that it remains now is to get the body shell back on and to get it running on the layout. And I think you can look at this situation one of 2 ways. The first is that this is a brand new model. Accurascale should have got it right, and I shouldn't be having to drill out bits of plastic in order to get the model right. However, I think you've also got to look at this from a slightly different angle, which is that there are plenty of manufacturers out there who would not have even acknowledged this being an issue, let alone issue a fix for it. And to be fair, had those fascias not been glued in, then this would have been a relatively straightforward process. So all I can hope is that accurascale will learn about this. They go back to their factory and they look at the root causes of why it's happened to make sure it doesn't happen again. But at the same time, I think the way that they've acted here has been great in terms of proactively sending me the message about the issue and then providing that support when I went through this process. And as I did mention there, I really recommend you get in contact with accurascale if you have one of the new Deltics, just to understand the situation, obviously get your new pieces and to figure out a way of going through this process. As you saw, because of the fascias being glued on my Deltic, and they're also glued on the one that I've been lent as well, it's a little bit more of an involved process than I think accurascale were expecting when they sent the email out. So just be mindful of that. And again, I'll reiterate that accurascale support are really good, really responsive, provide lots of good information. So if you do have any concerns at all, then I really do recommend you getting in contact with them and discussing it. Okay, let's move on now to our next loco. Okay, our second loco today is this. It's an accurascale Manor Class. And I was fortunate enough, if fortunate's the right word, to get this in the Hatton's closing down sale. So it only cost me just over £100. So I thought that was a really good value. It was my first accurascale loco. And I was really impressed with it and still am. But there are a few issues with the loco. And from my perspective, those are kind of minor things. And I think they can be overcome. And I think they've all been talked about before, so I don't think there's going to be any surprise in any of this. One is the decoder fitting. That's really fiddly. The connection between loco and tender is also a little bit fiddly and not great. The instructions in some places are a little bit lacking, which we'll kind of come to as we kind of go through some of the work that I'm going to do on the loco. And then there are also, if you have, I bought mine DCC ready. I put a chip in it to start with, and then after I saved up a bit of money, I bought a sound chip and put that in. Now, if you buy the sound chip separately, I don't know if these issues affect the locos that come kind of pre-sound fitted, but there are a few issues with the CV settings, just affecting a couple of little bits of kind of playability, I guess is the right way of describing it. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at putting those right today. But the other thing I need to do is to actually fix some damage that occurred when putting the DCC decoder in. And we'll come on to kind of some of the issues around that process, and some of the bits in the instructions that weren't particularly helpful around that. And then I'll also go through the process of kind of digging into the detail pack and adding some of those to improve the look, the overall look of the loco, add some crew, things like that. So another thing that accurascale support was able to help with was pointing me in the right direction. So I bought my Manor and decoder separately, and in that process, for whatever reason, I didn't have the sound function information. So accurascale support pointed me in the right direction. That information is on the website, and I will leave a link down below. Now, note that if you search for it on the main accurascale site, you won't find it. You have to have a look on the support site. And when I finally got access to this, I discovered that the loco had what I term active braking. So if you hold down F2, the loco will slow down. However, that function is not working correctly on the decoder. So that's one thing to fix. Let me just demo that, showing you what happens when I hold F2. So that's the first thing we're going to fix. The other slight issue is that there are various sound effects that will play when the loco is moving. Now, you could argue that you shouldn't press them when the loco is moving, but you can actually disable that function. So I'm going to do that as well and show you how that works. As I talked about in the last episode of On Shed, I have a separate programming track, and I do all of my decoder work using Decoder Pro from JMRI. So I will take you through that process now. First job is to put the Manor on the programming track, as you can see. Then I will go onto the laptop that's connected through my DigiTrax controller, and I will open up Decoder Pro. So this is my trains roster. So this is everything that I've imported into my roster on Decoder Pro. Now, to find the loco automatically, you can use the identify function, which is quite useful. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to also show you the LocoNet monitor box up the top here. So that will show us what happens when we hit identify in terms of the messages that are sent from the laptop through the controller and onto the programming track. So when I hit that button, you will notice that we query a number of different CVs. Now, there are a few complexities in the process of identification based on what results are returned, but in very simple terms, CV29 is queried to determine the addressing format in use. In my case, I'm using long addressing. So then the values of the long address in CV17 and 18 are then read. And in simple terms, that value is then looked up on the roster to determine which loco is on the programming track. In reality, it can get slightly more complex than that, but for our purposes, that's what we really need to understand. Now we've identified our loco in the roster, we can double click on that and that will open up its individual page. And as you can see within Decoder Pro, different decoder functions based on the type of decoder that has been identified will contain easy to use screens to help you change various settings without having to know the specific CVs. In this case, I'm going to use the manual process just to show you how that works. On this tab, you can see a full CV table. And what we would normally do is hit read, and that would read in the values. Now, on older decoders, there were 256 CV values, or 0 to 255. So that would take a few seconds to read that through. On newer decoders, there's been a need to add more support for more CVs because the decoders and the way that locos have been controlled has got more complex. That means that it's a more complex table that needs to be read. And I have to say this is where my knowledge starts to get a little bit fuzzy, because I've been doing some learning in this area. And from what I understand is that now additional CV values above 256 are then read using a kind of an index system, where you set different CV values and they then allow you to either read or write certain values higher than that. And the reason why this screen is now showing that it's going to take us hours to read all these values in is because it's going through that entire index table, and there are lots and lots of values, and that's a complex process to now read them. So what was a fairly short process is now really long. I'm going to cancel that shortly, because we don't need to import that whole table for what we're doing. If you want to sync up the information in your roster with what's on your loco, then you would need to leave that running. In our case, we're going to manually query any values that haven't been read just by leaving this for about 30 seconds or so. Right, so I skipped the video on slightly here. You can see that a lot of values have been read, but a lot of values are still showing as yellow because they haven't been read from the decoder. Now, as you can see, once we get above 255, you will see that there are these longer numbers appearing. In very simple terms, this is that index system. So the first value is the value that is in CV31. Then there's a dot, then the second value, which is the value in CV32. And then after that is then the CV value, for want of a better term. So if you want to address CV270, then you would have 270 after the final dot. Now, I don't want this to turn into a video on the complexities of modern decoders. So for today's purposes, what I will say is that all we need to know is the CV values of the sounds that we want to change, and then understand the state in which we don't, or that we either do or do want those to be played. So we don't want the uncoupling noises, the door slams or the guard's whistle to be playing while the loco is moving. So what we need to do is we need to find those index values and CV values to be able to do that. In order to fix our situation, you're just going to have to take my word for the values that you need for those first two indexes. And then the actual CV we need for the sound, we're going to look up from the accurascale information. So let's go look at that information first. This is the Manor DCC function sheet that I mentioned earlier on. And this gives us the information about which sounds are located in which sound slots on the chip. Now, unfortunately, it's not quite as simple as just reading a value off here and then going and changing it. We do need to understand the relationship between the sound slots and the CVs on the decoder. And I'm not going to take you through that process today. All you have to do for today is to believe me when I say which values are which CVs. And what I make them to be is CV257 is the coupling sounds. 321 is the door slam. And 337 is the guard's whistle. So what we want to do is we want to change those values so they don't play when our loco is moving. And if you want to figure all that for yourself, you'll need this sheet and also the loksound manual. And we'll come back to the manual shortly to fix the breaking issue. What I'm unsure at the moment is whether when you access those index values in Decoder Pro, whether it will automatically set the other two CV values that you need in order to access that index. I believe that happens, but just to be sure on this occasion, I'm going to manually set the values of 31 and 32. And what those index values are pointing at is the CV value that says whether the particular sound should be played while the loco is moving. We can obviously do the same thing if we wanted to for when the loco is stopped and things like that, but we don't want to go messing around too much. But those things can be very complex in terms of the way that these decoders are set up, so we're not going to go fiddling around too much with things. So what I'm doing here is I'm manually setting the values of CV 31 and 32 to 16 and 4, and then I'm going down to 16.4.257, which I believe is our uncoupler sound. And then I'm changing that value to 2 and writing it back to the decoder. And you can do exactly the same thing for those other sounds that we wanted to stop playing while the loco was moving. I'll then go back up and change CV31 and 32 back to what they were originally. But I suspect those values have been set automatically by Decoder Pro as it's scanning through that table when I read the values before. But just to be safe, I've gone through and made sure I did that, did all the steps. And before we go any further, let's just check that works on the loco. So I'll try playing the guard's whistle while stationary and then whilst moving. While stationary, it should still play, and then whilst moving, it should now not work. So let's give that a go. That has worked perfectly. So let's now move on to breaking, and you'll probably be relieved to hear that this is a much easier process. So just to be sure we get the breaking function correct, I've looked up the loksound 5 decoder manual on the loksound website, downloaded that and had a look for the breaking function, which is in this section here. And we're going to go with example 1 here, where we're going to reduce the speed down to 0. But theoretically, you can put any speed step you want in there. So maybe you want to slow down to a crawl. There's some examples in there and all the information you need. So just take a look in the manual. Now it's just a case of finding CV182 on the list and making sure we've read that value so that we can just double check we're in the right area. Enter the new value of 0 and then hit write. And we'll just put the loco back on the track and check that worked. We've now improved the playability of the loco through some CV tweaks. So let's move on to the physical detail of the loco. And the first thing we need to do is to fix all of the bits that got broken off when I fitted the decoder. So let's have a look at. Now, I think the reason for these pieces falling off was down to the design of the model, and the instructions also didn't help. So being a little bit pedantic, the instructions cover removing the tender body shell for DCC decoder fitting. However, all they really do is show where the screws are located. They don't give any indication as to what to expect when that tender body comes off. And in my case, the tender did not come off properly. It levered up at one end, and lots of bits of detail came falling off. And I didn't put them back on immediately because I didn't know whether they were push fit or glued or what. So that's why it's in this state. But let's start by having a look at the bits that we need to fix before we then move on to some more detailing. The loco to tender connector is a bit fiddly, but once that's out and I managed to separate the tender, fitting the pieces back was actually relatively easy. I decided to push fit the main plate, for want of a better term, and then through that put the handbrake with a tiny blob of super glue on the end just to keep that in place. And then likewise for that handrail, another tiny blob of super glue just to keep that from falling off. Hopefully those won't impede the tender lifting if I do ever need to get in and access the decoder again. Now all the decoder fitting damage has been fixed, we can move on and look at the accessories bag and see what we're going to add. So I will be adding the etched nameplates and number plates. I'll be adding a real coal load. I will be fitting some crew, and then out of these other pieces, I won't be fitting a coupling on the front of the loco. That looks like a smoke box dart that I won't fix. There's a wooden bar there to go across the tender, some cylinder guards, which I won't fit because the instructions just don't tell me how to do it. The full cylinder faces I'll be fitting. I'll put a screw link coupling on the front of the loco. The one on the back would foul the coupler. The pipe for the back of the tender, I don't know if this will foul the coupler, and also the instructions just aren't clear enough to figure that out. And then that wooden bar for the side of the tender, again, that's not mentioned in the instructions at all, so I have no idea where that's supposed to fit. So anything I'm unsure of, I'm just going to have to leave off because I don't want to put it in the wrong place and make it look odd. So let's get stuck in, and we'll start with nameplates. Now, I can't remember where I learned this, but etched name and number plates I always fit using matte varnish rather than glue. And the reason is that if you do get any seeping out from around the edges, if it's matte varnish, it's going to be far harder to see that than if it's super glue, which will obviously leave a mark and potentially mist as well. So all I'll do is paint the back of the number and nameplates with that varnish, move them carefully into place, and then just leave them till that goes off, which takes longer than glue, but I think it's worthwhile. Next up are the cylinder ends. So the cutaway ones are fitted so that the model will run on radius 2 curves. The tightest curves I have on my layout are radius 3, so just putting the full faces on should be no problem at all. One thing to note is that they are handed, so you can get them the wrong way around, and you'll notice that I've done that initially here. They are push fit, so you can just lever that out very carefully with a screwdriver or something like that, and then just push fit them in place. That's what I'm doing. And you can tell they're the right way around because the brass dot will be down the bottom, and you can only fit them one way where that will be the case. The next job is fitting some crew, and for this I have to thank Paul at Alton Model Centre. So when I was at the Alton show last week, I popped into town to the model shop, and Paul was really helpful in terms of talking through some of the different options that I could use to put realistic crew into the Manor. He did have the resting fireman and seated driver set from accurascale, and they did look like they were the best choice. So these are color 3D printed, I believe, and they do look pretty good. The only thing I would say is that the skin tones look a little bit grey, even for a driver and a fireman. So I just touched that up with a paintbrush and then pop them into the cab. Now, one thing to be mindful of is because they're 3D printed, they can be really brittle. So just handle them very carefully. If you do have any problems with bits breaking, then again, get in contact with accurascale support. So I used a bit of super glue to fix these in place. I popped the fireman in through the window and just put some glue on his arms. And then the driver I engineered in through the gap between tender and loco, popped him on the seat with a little bit of super glue on there, and that seems to have held them in place. I think they look really good. And the final job was to fit a coal load. So what I did was I took the existing accurascale piece and I put some coal on top of that because it's because the plastic piece is not filled right up to the top. That gives you a little bit of space to do it. I decided to keep that piece also as removable. So what I did was I put neat PVA all over that plastic coal. I then got some Pico coarse coal, poured that over the glue, shook off any that wasn't sticking, and then went back into any of the gaps in there with some Pico fine coal, and then just left that to dry. Once it was dry, I then gave that a blast with some matte varnish in a spray can, and even though that's matte, that hasn't taken all of the shine off the coal, which I think is good, and that's what you can see here, and I think that looks really cool. Okay, I hope you enjoyed some of those running shots. It's really great to have been able to kind of get these locos fixed, for want of a better term, and kind of running nicely on the layout. And just to finish up, I thought it'd be worth just mentioning my thoughts on accurascale through this process. Now I'm relatively new back into the hobby, so I hadn't really heard of accurascale until maybe 2 years or so ago. And from a kind of newcomer's perspective, I've been really impressed with everything that they've done in terms of the way that they present themselves, the videos they put out, and from my own personal experiences, the models they produce are really high quality, great value. And also another important thing, that we as humans all make mistakes, manufacturers all make mistakes, but one of the things I've seen from accurascale that's been really clear is that if they do get something wrong, they'll own that and they'll do their best to put it right. And I think that's a really good place to be when you're a manufacturer. If you can do that, then I think you're going to earn a lot of loyalty. And I've really been impressed by that. That includes their support team, who've been really responsive and kind of really helpful in this process that I've been going through with these. So fair play to them. So I'll certainly keep my eye out for more accurascale locos in the future. There is a Class 50 arriving in the family at some point, so I'm very hopeful to get that on the layout here. That will need renaming and renumbering for reasons that I won't go into now, but I'm hoping that will find its way down here and I'll be able to have a play around with that at some point in the future. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this episode of On Shed. It was nice to spend a bit of time getting stuck into some locos and getting them improved and running on the layout. For me, my focus now is to get back onto the layout on all the things that I'm currently working on. So hopefully there'll be another video soon with my progress. Thank you all for watching. If you haven't subscribed, please do consider doing that. There'll be a button appearing in a second, as well as some other videos from the channel. And I look forward to seeing you on another video soon. Bye-bye.